really good that you're here. I guess it's scary coming to church too. I remember the first time I came to church. But I think it is a really good thing. If there's anybody here for the first time, you've made a good decision. I'm so glad I became a Christian. I've seen God lead in my life and answers to prayer and the reassurance. I've heard God's voice directing my mind. And that's why I guess I'm so passionate about God. And I can see the changes that He's made in my life. And I can see the changes, and I've read about the changes that He's made in the lives of other people. And to me, it is very, very hurtful that there is this whole culture out there that is saying, well, Genesis is wrong, it's ridiculous. You know, how can you believe in creation and be worried about keeping the Sabbath? And of course, once you throw away the first books of Genesis, you throw away marriage, and we see in society the whole concept of marriage and the family is being attacked. And it was interesting in Sabbath school this morning, we read the verse in Matthew chapter 4, where when Jesus was confronted with Satan, and they had that battle of the wits out there in the wilderness, Jesus' final words were these: "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." The world is giving us a message saying, serve ourselves. But God's saying, no, we have a loving Creator who desires a relationship with us. We've all been made special. And the good news is that God Himself confronted Satan and said, I will die in the place of my beloved humans. And He did. And because of that, God now has the freedom to forgive us. The angels, the universe have seen that God is a God of His word. He's a God of righteousness. He's a God of justice. He's a God of love. And He Himself died so that God's righteousness could be preserved. And that righteousness is that He doesn't tolerate sin. Sin has no part in God's kingdom. Selfishness, pride, cheating, hurting other people has no part in God's kingdom. Adam and Eve were tricked, weren't they? When Satan said to Eve, did God say you won't die? Surely you won't die. You'll become like God. Satan was subtly saying, God is a liar. You don't have to trust Him. And that's why it was so difficult. When Eve took the fruit, what she was doing was she was saying she was believing Satan. She was believing the lie that God was a liar. Very subtle play, very subtle trap that Satan set. But God didn't want Adam and Eve to die. He loved us. He had made Adam and Eve and their future progeny to be these beautiful creatures made in His image with a mind like His that He could love and interact with. But now He was forced in front of the angels to uphold His rule, that if you sin, you die, eliminated from the system, or what should He do? And that's why the beautiful plan of salvation, that God died in His place. And when you think about it, all since that time, God has struggled to preserve the memory of Him, the knowledge of God. When you look down through history, the attempts to wipe out all knowledge of God, there were basically just the Jews and a few people here and there around the world that were clinging to that knowledge of God, the Creator. Everybody else had abandoned it for idolatry. And today we have the same thing. We live in our Western cultures now, which once were Christian, but have largely now become dominated by science. And in particular, the theory of evolution, that everything just somehow formed, that in the beginning there was a bang, some sort of process, and as a result, all the living things, the beautiful structure of the universe, all the living things in this world formed by chance. Now, we know that that is impossible. Now, I work as a scientist, and I have a small amount of time here now. And what I want to look at is the evidence that we have now that we can trust the Bible. I'm going to go through it quickly, but you can keep a copy of the presentation. Some of it will be quick. I don't have time to explain all the things. But what I want to try and do is give you a very quick over picture that there is a lot of evidence that supports the Bible and that evolution is absolutely impossible. It can't explain how we got here. We can see, it's common sense. All living things start from some sort of seed or egg. And all these living things are made up of molecules or chemicals. Everything is made up of chemicals. Now, what we observe around is that all life comes from something that is already living. We don't observe things coming, just forming from dead things. Matter of fact, that's the basis of food sterilisation, isn't it? That once we've killed and everything in that can, that it's not going to come alive again and poison you. The other interesting thing is that every living thing, its structure is determined by a code, a chemical code that we call DNA. That code is just unbelievably complex, and too little is made of that code. People think, oh yeah, that code's simple. That code is enormously complex, and every living thing, every flower that we saw in Sabbath school this morning has a different code, a unique code. And that code is so complex that the code for a simple little single cellular bacteria would be about as complex as the operations manual for a nuclear submarine. And once we get to the largest creatures, the amount of data that is in there would be similar to the operation manuals to control everything in a large city. All the operations of everything, all the factories, all the schools, all the traffic lights, all the sewerage systems, all the electricity generation systems. The amount of information encoded in the codes of living things is unimaginably huge. Science essentially is saying, well, we can't explain how the first life formed, but the fact that it's here, obviously it did form. And then they say that there are mutations, changes, little chemical changes in the code that occurred over a long period of time, and these little changes gradually produced all the different types of animals. So you've got your bacteria evolved into yeast, evolved into worms, evolved into insects, and into fish and so forth, and fish into amphibians, and then reptiles and birds. And what they're saying is that all these small changes occurred. Now that sounds like a pretty simple story, but in reality that doesn't happen. Textbooks claim that we've observed evolution. And again, this is a really complicated area, and I'm just going to try and give you a picture now that I can explain the difference. There's evolution that we observe, and there's evolution that we don't observe. If we take this VW car here, that is made in a factory by robots that are controlled by a computer program. Say there's a mistake in the computer program, somehow, a glitch, and the robot then doesn't put the mudguards and doors on the car. Can you imagine that? It's putting the car together, but it leaves off the mudguards and the doors. That car is now lighter, and it doesn't look like a Beetle anymore, does it? It doesn't look like a VW car. Can you imagine that in your mind? One without mudguards and doors? Now, that's the sort of evolution that we observe. We observe those changes. Why? Because those changes result in a loss of existing code, a loss of material. There's no mudguards and doors on the car, and it looks different. So consequently, Darwin observed wingless beetles, and blind worms and all these sort of things. He observed situations where there was a loss of information, or animals lose their pigment coat, the moths, and this sort of thing. And so they change colour. But in all those examples, they're still moths, they're still beetles, but they've lost part of their code. Another example might be the robot makes a mistake and it says, of course they produce right and left-hand cars, in the factory. Somehow the computer program, there's a glitch, and it begins making the little beetle cars with both right and left-hand drive. So those cars would be selected by learner driver schools. They would choose to buy those cars. But it's just a duplication of existing code. It's not new code. That there is a convertible VW car, and the owner drives it out, and then some rain comes over and he presses a button and a little electric motor whirs and operates a lever system and pulls out the top that's been tucked away, and it comes up. The VW now looks different. It's got a top on it. But all that machinery was already there. It was just dormant. There was a change in environmental conditions and the car changed its shape. But it was already programmed to do that. We see lots of examples of that in nature. There are codes within living organisms, surplus codes for all sorts of things that are switched on. So Dawkins, in his book Evolution, the Greatest Show on Earth, talks about how you have male guppies in ponds where there are lots of predators and they don't produce colours. Take those male guppies, put them in a pond with females where there are no predators, and the offspring males will have colours, because without the environmental stress pressures of predators, the genes to produce colours are now switched on. It's not evolution. Those codes were already there. They're the classic examples of evolution that are given in textbooks that demonstrate, see, evidence for evolution. But they're not. They're not evidence of new code. Evolution requires a new code to form. If evolution was really happening, what would happen would be this. In the VW factory, there would be a glitch in the program and a VW would come out with an army cannon on it. Or it would come out with caterpillar tracks and armour plate. But you see, there's no code in the program for an army cannon. For a cannon, you need a whole lot of new things. You need the new alloys to make the high tensile alloys to resist the explosion. You need the special features of the cannon and its, sort of alignment system and all this sort of thing. The computer programs that control the firing and all this sort of thing. They're not in the code. And everybody knows who've written computer programs, no way can you make simple changes to that code and suddenly it's going to change and produce the code for an army cannon or armour plate or caterpillar track. But that's what evolution requires. Evolution says that mutations in the code produce totally new functions, totally new body parts. We know that that is impossible. Look, you have in the textbooks, and Dawkins talks about this, there was a drought and the fish that had this mutated fin that could sort of drag itself across to the next pond survived and its bred, and then over a while it became more efficient and developed into a shoulder blade, an arm, leg system, pelvic system. But when you think about it, to change from a fin, if you have a code for a fin and you change that then to a code for an arm, you've got to encode for the codes to make all the little compounds that constitute the surface of the joints, in the joints, and that all those cells that are on the surface are different from the cells underneath. Anybody that's studied anatomy and doctors that have done the knee replacements and these sort of things, all the different types of cells that are just in that knee joint alone, let alone all the structures that you've got to make to the tendons, the joints, the muscles, the nerves, the blood vessels. All those things have to be encoded for, and those codes are not like writing a letter, the cat sat on the mat. These codes, just to produce those slightly new structures, are far more complex than the operation manual for a nuclear submarine that works. And we know that that doesn't happen. So, we actually don't observe any examples of evolution. The other thing is too, we talk about the code, right? And there we've got an illustration there. You've got the DNA code represented by the little helix. There are a whole lot of molecular machines that enable DNA to work. First of all, you've got to have the enzyme system that unzips the two halves. So DNA is there with the backup system. There's two copies of the code. It has to be unzipped with a little enzyme system. And that little enzyme system goes into another little molecular machine that makes a copy of part of that code called messenger RNA. And that messenger RNA then diffuses through the cell and goes to another little factory called a ribosome. And when it goes into that ribosome reads the code and it assorts fragments of proteins called amino acids and assembles them according to that code. They're amazing little molecular factories that have to be there in place for that first code to work. But there's more. The code to make the code reading systems and the molecular factories is encoded in the original code. How could that happen? How could a code form that encodes the mechanism to read its own code? And that's why the top molecular biologists in the world recognise evolution absolutely impossible. Could not have happened. Life could not have formed by chance. So there we've got the codes for the different cells. What evolution claims is that there's an error, right? There's a mutation. The mutation, there's some damage caused somewhere, chemically, radiation or whatever. It changes the messenger RNA. When the damaged mRNA is read, it produces a damaged protein. The likelihood of that then meaningful and going to produce some useful structure is so remote that we know statistically it's impossible. But that's the claim. The claim is that these mutations were inherited and went on to produce new organisms. But let's look at this. Mutations don't produce new code. Mutations produce disease. The Johns Hopkins medical database for genetic diseases now has over 10,000 human diseases that are registered as caused by mutations. Mutations cause disease. They don't produce new functioning organisms. And the other thing is too, within the laws of chemistry and physics, there's no code for information, for design. We look at the structures of those flowers we saw in Sabbath school this morning. Amazing design of the reproductive parts in the flower there. And all those parts are made up of little cells that have specific functions and design. It is just mind-boggling. So we can do calculations. Something is defined as impossible as being a chance of 1 in less than 10 to the power 150. And the reason why we pick on that is it's estimated that there are about 10 to the power 80. That's 1 with 80,000, 10 to the power 80, one with 80 zeros after it. Estimate that there's that many atoms in the universe. And so if you had a universe for as many atoms as there are in the universe, and each one of those universes has as many atoms as we know in the universe, that's an awful lot of atoms. Do you get the picture? Right? As many atoms as there are in our universe, in a total number of universes as there are many atoms in the universe, the chances of finding one specific atom with a little dot on it out of all those atoms is the chances of 1 in 10 to the 160. But the probability of just one small gene, one small piece of meaningful code forming by chance is in the order of 10 to the power 190. In other words, far greater than impossible, just for one gene alone to form by chance. So when we do the actual science, when we do the actual calculations, the probability tells us that evolution is impossible. Many students think, and many people think, that scientists know how evolution works. Scientists don't know how evolution works. That's the bottom line. There's no known mechanism to explain how the new code can form. I repeat that. There is no known mechanism to explain how new genetic codes can form. And this is recognised. There we've got University of California, Berkeley, one of the top evolutionary research universities in the United States. And this is on their website, official website, and I'll put these up, Google it, because I'm very interested in people knowing data and facts. What's the actual data? Not what people are asserting out there that evolution works and it can explain everything. What is the real science? The real science is biologists don't know how evolution works. And one of the main things that they're trying to find is how does evolution produce new complex features? They don't know. Right? So this is from a top secular university. James Tour, and you can Google him, and this is why I put these up. Google it. Check out what I'm saying. He is one of the world's most highly cited chemists in the literature. That means his research is quoted by other scientists more than any other chemist. And he builds molecular machines. He's into building molecules, specialist molecules. And what he says is on his website, he's a creationist and a Christian. When he talks to top biologists in public, they assert, yeah, of course, evolution works. And they make a big issue of it. But when he talks to in private, they admit they don't know how evolution works. So, for the new DNA to form is fundamental. Mutations and these environmental changes, they're not going to produce evolution. For a new species to form, you've got to have massive changes in the code. And people have done these experiments. Dr. Richard Lenski at Michigan State University took 12 groups of E. coli bacteria and bred them through thousands of generations. Now, Richard Dawkins has written a book, and I was in a bookshop the other day, and there are dozens of copies of his books. They don't have copies of my book, Evolution Impossible. But you go in the bookshops, there's dozens of copies of Richard Dawkins' books, and his book, Evolution, the Greatest Show on Earth. The only example that he could give of a scientific evidence of new genetic information forming by chance was the Lenski experiment. Now, what happened there was Lenski bred these bacteria, and after 30,000 generations, they found two of the groups were suddenly reproducing faster than others. And what they found was that those particular groups were using citrate, which was present in the mixture as a buffer, as food. The normal food was glucose. They'd been selected bacteria that couldn't use citrate, but two of the groups began after 30,000 generations of using citrate. There's little E. coli. But what actually happened was there was just the duplication of an existing citrate transfer gene. So in the wild, E. coli utilised citrate as a food. They had selected bacteria that weren't using citrate, the food, but they didn't know there was a dormant gene there. And after a while, there was a mutation that happened to duplicate the citrate transfer gene next to a promoter gene, which switched on the citrate transfer gene. So now the bacteria could use citrate as food. And Dawkins raves about this. See evolution in action. And what it is it's just, there are only 45 base pairs in that little particular mechanism. Very, very small piece of code happened to be duplicated. But the bottom line is it was pre-existing code. Nothing new. And they're still E. coli bacteria. Lenski's now bred them through 60,000 generations. They're still E. coli. They haven't changed into anything else. So we have no experimental evidence for evolution as well. You have the classic examples in the textbook during the Industrial Revolution. All the white moths got eaten because of the soot background. But they were carrying recessive genes. And even though they were mainly black moths breeding, every now and again there would be a white moth. So once they cleaned up the environment, the white moths regenerated. And they talk about this evolution, but it's not. It's just pre-existing codes that were there, that were dormant, that were reactivated by environmental pressures. Same with your wingless beetles that we've talked about. And on the beetles on a windy island developed mutations. So the ones that didn't have good wings, didn't fly, they didn't get blown off the island, so more of those were able to mate and reproduce. But that's loss of code like we were talking about in the VW. Now, the other thing is too, people have very little idea of how much code is out there. The massive amount of code that is there. So if we look at the code for a simple E. coli bacteria, you've got about 4.5 million base pairs. If we go up to a little yeasty beastie, then you're up to about 12 million base pairs. Another 7.5 million or so new pieces of code just to change from the complexity of a bacteria to a yeast. Still a single-celled organism. But if that's going to evolve, you've got to produce 7.5 million new pieces of code. That's sort of like the information in a pile of biochemistry textbooks this high, arising by chance. Can you imagine a little 2-year-old sitting down a word processor and typing letters and writes out the biochemistry textbooks that work about that high? Can you imagine that happening? Is it possible? No, we've already done the calculations. We've shown just to work out a small code of about 1,000 base pairs is impossible to arise by chance. But yet this amount of information arose by chance. And I think the problem is that people, most of us just can't comprehend in our mind how much code is there. Now, I've written books. My book, Evolution Impossible, it's about that thick, 60,000 words. Took me 2 years to write and research. But you imagine writing a complex biochemistry textbook with all, say, the immune system mechanisms and all these different cycles, biochemical cycles, being typed by chance, by just random. We know intuitively it would never happen, ever, in a billion, trillion, quadrillion years. So evolution, if we go from our little yeasty beastie up to a simple little 5 millimetre long nematode, little roundworm, right, we now have a digestive system and basic reproductive system and so forth. We're now up to 97 million pieces of code. Huge, and they say all this new code arose by chance. If we then go, so we can see the amount of genes, we go up to 97 million base pairs, and we have all this extra code, massive amount of new code, has to form by chance, never been observed in experiments, and no known chemical mechanism whereby it can form. And of course, if we go up to a mammal, little mousy thing, we've got 2.5 billion letters in our code, all of which then have to form by chance. But the little mousey is only one of 5,500 known mammals. And then, of course, when we consider all the other different types of animals, all the insects and birds and fish and creepy crawlies and all these different ones, thousands of them, matter of fact 2 million known catalogued species on Earth at the present time, which represents only 1 to 2% of what's lived in the past. So we know 100 to 200 million different types of organisms have existed in the past, all with complex codes that involve millions of pieces of letters of code, all in specific order, to arise by chance. You know, it is startlingly obvious that it is absolutely impossible. The codes that are out there are amazing. And why don't we see these forming? Why can't we form the codes in the lab? The top scientists in the world can't write new codes. There was a big write-up in one of the journals a couple of years ago that in the laboratory, a team of scientists were able to chemically synthesise a section of DNA code and put it into bacteria, and it worked. So here we've got a team of scientists working in a laboratory with high technology, copied a piece of pre-existing code and were able to form it chemically and get to work. And that was hailed. And yet what we're saying is, well, hang on, out in nature all these codes are supposed to form by chance by themselves? Get the picture? We don't observe the codes forming in nature. They can't form in nature. They're long polymer molecules. The chemical reactions don't work to form them. When you study chemistry, you learn that there are certain reactions that work. Salt, acid plus base forms salt plus water. But there are certain reactions that don't work as well. And so those reactions don't go. Some reactions do. The reactions to form the DNA code don't work in nature. They don't form. We've got to construct very special environments for them to happen, and special enzyme systems to make them happen. So we don't observe them forming in nature. There's no known chemical way that they could form. And yet evolution claims that it did. But what do we observe? What we observe, well, I'm getting ahead of myself here, is the very opposite to evolution. We observe extinction. Now this is E.O. Wilson, Professor of Entomology at Harvard University, a world authority on insects. And what's he telling us? 0.25% per year, we're losing genetic code. Some of you might use the Barley Max Superfoods breakfast cereal. Okay, so that CSI went and they discovered a Tibetan barley, a barley in Tibet that had these genes for these particular resistant starch. One of the reasons scientists go to the Amazon rainforest and New Guinea and this sort of thing is looking for species that haven't lost their code. Why? Because natural selection destroys code. Darwin talks about evolution precedes mutation, natural selection. Natural selection destroys codes. We lose codes. We're losing genetic information. We're not making it, we're not evolving it, we're losing it. We're losing it at a great rate. That's what we observe. What we observe is the loss of code, not new codes forming. What we observe is the very opposite to evolution. But yet our children are still being taught evolution. If evolution was really happening, we should see new species totally evolving every 3 or 4 years. We should be able to observe them in the laboratory, especially with high turnover species like bacteria that reproduce every 30 minutes or so. Lenski bred them through 60,000 generations. They were still E. coli. Didn't even change into a different genus of bacteria. When we look at what we can know now, evolution is absolutely impossible and never occurred. What we observe now is the loss of code, extinction. The other thing is, of course, DNA has repair mechanisms that essentially prevent evolution taking place. So, scientists observed the steady loss of information. We observed plants and animals steadily becoming extinct. We observed that mutations produce disease. What about the fossil record? When we look in the fossil record, we find fully formed animals. We don't find animals changing from one into another. We find fully formed animals. So, for example, the plants appear, they're exactly the same. Flowering plants, so those beautiful flowers, they appear in the fossil record fully formed. There's no evolutionary change in plants solely developing flowers. They just suddenly appear, fully formed. The same with insects. We find worms, then we find little insects with wings, winged insects. Flight in insects is extremely complex. The amazing wing designs, the hydraulic systems that operate them, the joints, amazing design. We can't build anything like that. You know, we pay billions of dollars for a jet fighter plane that can't reproduce. We've got to make them. God has all these little hornets and things, and they just reproduce themselves. You know, and we talk about, you know, it wasn't God's plan to kill all the people in Canaan there. What was his original plan? Send in the hornets. I remember driving my tractor once and I brushed against a tree with a hornet's nest in it, and I tell you what, my tractor didn't go fast enough. I jumped off and ran. And they reproduce, and we spend all this money building these machines. They can't reproduce. Anyway, I get off track a bit. The thing is, when we look in the fossil record, the fossils appear fully formed. Turtles appear in the fossil record, fully formed. No evolution of turtles, no evolution of insects, no evolution of flowering plants. When we look down at the very lowest fossils, say right down in the oldest layers, the Cambrian, we find trilobites. Now, I should have brought along a picture of a trilobite, but they're, you know, those round animals, they're like that, and they've got long fins, segmented bodies, big head, big eyes. Right in the oldest rocks, we find trilobites. They've got a reproductive system, they've got eyes, they've got segmented bodies. Extremely complex DNA code in a trilobite. You've got nautiluses, which are predators, members, you know, same family as the octopuses and squids. We find those right down in the Cambrian. They have jet propulsion systems. Matter of fact, in some of the oldest Cambrian rocks, the nautiluses are more sophisticated in terms of their design jet propulsion systems than the ones further up. And yet, this is right at the beginning of evolution. And this is the other picture. We think, oh yeah, we went from the slime up to more complex animals and so forth. Whoa, hang on. Right down in the Cambrian, we find a huge range of highly advanced developed organisms in the bottom fossil rocks. But there's more. There's a lot more. There's lots of guys that have written about these things and from the biochemistry. But I guess one of the things that people have is that, what about radiometric dating? Doesn't that prove that the Earth is really old? Well, let's have a look at radiometric dating. And again, this is complex. There's a lot I could say about it, and I've got just a couple of minutes. But I wanted to reassure you that there are major problems with radiometric dating. So let's have a quick look. Now, what I'm going to look at now is some fairly recent data, right? Post-1997. So this is when we had the best mass spectrometers now available to us, so we can get the most accurate results. So radiometric dating is based on highly accurate, highly sensitive analysis of isotopes. And what an isotope is, it's simply an element is defined by the number of protons in the nucleus. The weight of an element is defined by the number of neutrons in the nucleus. If you have a different number of neutrons in the nucleus and hence a different weight, you have a different isotope. But it's the same element. Some isotopes, because of the extra neutrons or fewer neutrons, are therefore not stable, nuclear stable, and they break down and emit radiation. And so that's a radioisotope. And the rate at which it breaks down can be used to calculate ages. Now, most of these radioisotopes, they have half-lives of millions of years. Right? So it's going to take millions of years for half of them to break down. And so automatically you're going to get a result in terms of millions of years. And so to illustrate that, you get different results on different systems, right? This is Somerset Dam out the back here. I think it's part of your water supply. Volcanic intrusion, so we mainly radiometrically date volcanic rocks because they have the minerals in them that are radioactive rather than sedimentary rocks. Very difficult to date. We can do carbon-14 dating in sedimentary rocks if they have limestone or fossils, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But here we can see this is the actual data, right? Potassium argon, isochron. Now, isochron method, you have radioactive dating, but if you do a range of different minerals, and there's mathematically a way you can plot, it's called isochron dating. It's the most accurate form of radiometric dating we have. So this is the most accurate data that we have available to us, right? Fairly recent results, less than 20 years old. And look at the ages. Potassium argon, 174. Rubidium strontium, 393. Samarium neodymium, 259. Lead, 1,425, all of those millions of years. How old's the rock? So if you're writing up your geology thesis, what value are you going to put in there? So the value that you put in will be the fossil age, the one value closest to the fossil age. So probably the samarium neodymium result, 259 million years. Because the conventional fossil ages are based on estimates, unproven estimates based on erosion rates, by the way. And then we get a range of radiometric results and we pick the result that's closest to the fossil age. A lot of work done on the Grand Canyon. There's some more ages, and these are just not single measurements. As you can see, 19 samples. The rubidium strontium isochron age, first set of 19 samples, 1,111 million years, plus or minus 81. The second one was 892 million years. So you can see that there's 200 million years difference in those ages for the same method, depending on the two lots of samples. Samarium neodymium, nearly 400 or 500 million years more. Lead, different values again. Potassium argon, much shorter age. Again, so how old do you say the rock is? What value do you put in your geology report, in your thesis? Another set of days. Similar sort of results, big range. But look, let's look at some recent data. And I put up there, they've dated the volcanic lava in Hawaii. And the thing is, they still get millions of years. That's Nauahoe in New Zealand, right? Mount Nauahoe erupted in 1948, 50, and 1954. Now, this is work done here, Australian National University in Canberra. You can look the papers up on the internet. This is the research. These rocks, when they were analysed, were 50 years old. Right? They erupted around 1950. The analysis was done around 2000. They used a number of different methods. Rubidium strontium age, 133 million years. Samarium neodymium, 197 million years. Lead, 3,908 million years. The rocks were 50 years old. So if young rocks give millions of years old, how old is any rock? We can't know. The other thing is, though, there's lots of other ways we can estimate the age of the Earth. Geographers have been measuring sedimentary rates in rivers for long periods of time. We know at the rate at which our continents are eroding. Our continents would erode away in less than 10 million years. So how come the dinosaurs can be 65 million plus years old? How can those be structures there if we know from data we measure today that the continents would erode in less than 10 million years? And secondly, that's based on our current rainfall, and we know that rainfall in the past was much higher. If we looked at the sediments on the ocean floor, they would all form in, 30 million years. If we looked at the volcanic deposits that we observe around the world and the rate of volcanic eruptions and the outpouring of lava on the surface of the Earth, they would all form in less than 30 million years. But we know that in the past the volcanic activity was way, way stronger and more frequent than it is today, fortunately. But even on these most conservative estimates, they totally disagree with the radiometric dating results for the continents. So the continents can't be that old. But there's more. And I mentioned this yesterday. Each of us have more errors in our DNA code than our parents. And our children have more errors in their code than we have. In other words, the codes that regulate the structures and the life-giving processes on every living thing on Earth are running down. The errors in the codes are accumulated. This is not fringy research. You can look these papers up. They're published in Nature, in Science. The top scientists are aware of this. The codes for all living things are running down, called genetic entropy. When we do the calculations, we know that we can measure the rates, the rate at which we're accumulating errors in the code, and we know that at most, mitochondrial DNA can only be 100,000 years old. At most, and most likely less than 10,000 years old. Why? Because if it was any older, the errors in the DNA accumulated would be at such a high level that it wouldn't work anymore. See, it depends. If there's an error in some of the microDNA codes, those codes influence very large amounts of the DNA processes. If those errors occur, the damage is amplified by very large amounts. So hence the variation, whether it's 100,000 years or 10,000 years. We don't know where the errors are going to accumulate. So again, when we do measurements that we can measure here and now in the laboratory, it all points to life on Earth being very young. But there's more. Back in 1991, scientists were able to extract DNA from fossil leaf remains, and they published it. Viable fragments of DNA have been preserved. Now, DNA is an extremely large polymer molecule. It's very sensitive to break down. Large polymer, organic type polymer molecules break down. They're not stable. They're not like minerals. All organic matter gradually breaks down. These long polymer molecules, they're not chemically stable because of their structure, and they break down. So in 97, Mary Schweitzer, I think it was 97, decided to section a dinosaur femur that was in one of the museum collections there in Montana, and she found soft tissue and blood. And so since that time, many scientists have gone out and have studied and found soft tissue in the dinosaur remains. Now, when Mary Schweitzer first published her work, they said you can't analyse. Your histology's all wrong. But she kept doing it, and other scientists doing it, and then in 2009, a team from 3 universities, so that they were saying nobody's rigging the results here, one from Harvard, University of South Carolina, and from Montana University. The 3 groups of scientists went out, hired an excavator, went out the Morrison Formation, dug down in areas where they believed they'd find dinosaur fossils, found undisturbed dinosaur remains, dug it up, soft tissue. And we know that it would break down. Again, published in Science. 2 top science journals in the world are Nature, UK, Science in the US. So we're not talking about fringy results here. To get a result published in Science, that's a very high result. But since then, there's been lots more published. University of Lund in Sweden, again, they dug up this sample of remains of a Cretaceous lizard, so the Cretaceous period, limestones 60 or 70 million years old, presumably, and what they find, soft tissue. And this doesn't come out in the abstract, but what they did was they carbon dated it. You know what the carbon dating age turned out to be? 24,600 years. Nothing like the 70 million years that it was dated by the conventional fossil records, which would be the value you would use in your thesis. And we know that collagen stability under the best conditions would be only 130,000 years. Under the conditions likely in nature, it's less than 20,000 years. But there's more. See, we should not even be afraid of carbon-14 results of around 20,000 years, because carbon-14 values are based on the carbon-14 value in the atmosphere at the present time. Carbon-14 is formed by cosmic rays hitting the upper atmosphere. Those cosmic rays are repelled by the Earth's magnetic field. In the past, the Earth's magnetic field was much stronger. We know it's decayed 6% in the last 100 years. The stronger magnetic field means less cosmic rays reaching the Earth, which means lower levels of carbon-14, which artificially increases the age, the apparent age. So when we correct for magnetic field effects and so forth, values of around 20, 30, 40,000 years are all going to come back to 3, 4, 5,000 years. They come back to the biblical ages and dates, which is amazing. But there's more. You see, scientists hadn't worried about analysing coal because coal is 30 million to 300 million years old. So there shouldn't be any carbon-14 there, because carbon-14 has a half-life 5,730 years or thereabouts. And therefore, after 100,000 years, there would be no detectable carbon-14 that we could measure. So the fact that we find measurable carbon-14 in the dinosaur remains, in coal, in diamonds, in absolute scientific terms, tells us that those samples are only thousands of years old maximum. Otherwise, the carbon-14 would have all decayed. Matter of fact, I heard just about a month ago one of the CSIRO scientists saying that with the current carbon dioxide emissions, we're diluting the carbon-14 level in the atmosphere to the extent that if you took a T-shirt in your wardrobe and sent it in for carbon-14 dating, it would say it was made in the year 1000. Did you get that? It would say that it was about 1,000 years old. I know this is a lot to take in, but this is the data because of those changes and those artificial ages. So scientists weren't expecting to find any carbon-14 in coal, but they did. They found carbon-14 in coal. They found carbon-14 in diamonds, and diamonds are supposed to be the age of the continents, billions of years old. And they found measurable carbon-14. And these results have also been replicated. For example, the University of California, using the most accurate mass spectrometer that there was available to measure carbon-14, and they again found carbon-14 in diamonds. So these results provide here and now scientific data that show that the Earth isn't very old. Life on Earth is not very old. And there's lots of links out there now. There's lots. So, what about, were the Genesis days 24-hour days? Well, they've got to be. When God created the plants on that first day, if there's no sun and moon, the plants are going to die. So they need the solar cycles. We have the nitrogen cycle that relies on bacteria, plants and animals. We have so many ecosystems. God had to create things in a very short period of time. I don't have time to go into it now. I can see that time is getting away and you've been very, very patient. But one of the things is that, in my view anyway, the account in Genesis is very, very realistic scientifically. And we don't have to be afraid. The universe could be created at that time as well. I did an experiment with people that came on Friday night. And I'll do this experiment now because I think we need to have good data, don't we? We need to have good data. We need to base what we believe on good data. And I want you to do this very simple experiment. I want you to move your little finger. Can you move your little finger? Okay, you moved your little finger. How did you move your little finger? You thought about it, didn't you? Okay, I'll ask you a question now. Does your brain have mass? Can you weigh your brain? Yes, you can. Does it have volume? Yes, you can cut it out and you could squash it into a measuring cylinder and measure its volume. Can you weigh your thoughts? Can you put your thoughts on a metal balance and weigh them? Can you measure the volume of your thoughts? How far up a measuring cylinder your thoughts go? So your non-material thoughts affected electrical voltages in your brain that affected nerves, that affected muscles that moved your little finger. Your thoughts are non-material. That's why Paul talks about we have our body here, it's just this tent. What is you is your thoughts. That's what's going to go to heaven. That's what interacts with God. But your thoughts are non-material. What makes up you is your thoughts. And that's why Paul talks about how important it is to guard the mind. The mind is us. The mind are our thoughts. God is spiritual. God isn't matter. If our thoughts can move our little finger, if my thoughts can create a beautiful work of art, of pottery, some new sculpture, can change the surface of the world and make a new garden, why can't God's thoughts instantaneously create the universe, create life on earth, the animals? I can picture in my mind a story. I can picture in my mind a novel, a film, an event. But God, why can't God, if he pictures all these amazing things, animals, plants and so forth, then with his mind, in his power, they become real. And that's what the Bible said. His thoughts he spoke and they became. And all the evidence that we have points to that. There's no known explanation for the origin of the universe. Physics, the known laws of physics cannot explain the origin of stars. It doesn't work. Hence they have to have all these made-up theories, dark energy, dark matter, inflation theory, all of which have been unproven, all of which there is no experimental evidence for, all of which they're desperately looking for experimental evidence for, because without it they can't explain the origin of the universe. But they haven't got the evidence there. It's not there. Every time they look for it, it doesn't work. Life is a miracle. The universe is a miracle. The fact that we are here is a miracle. It defies the known laws of physics and chemistry. But our mind, again, is non-material. Most of the detractors of creation believe that the material world is all there is. But when you think about it, the mind is non-material. And that's why one of the top philosophers in America, Thomas Nagel, an atheist, wrote his book, came out a couple of years ago, Mind and the Cosmos. Why the Darwinian paradigm must ultimately be proved false. Why? Because evolution works with chemicals and molecules. How can evolution explain the origin of the mind? Sorry, I'm shouting. I didn't mean to upset people. I get really passionate about this. We have so much evidence right in front of us that the Bible is true. And what's the Bible telling us? The Bible is telling us that there is a loving Creator God who made us, that calls us to worship, to remember him each week, who loves us so much he died for us, who listens to our prayers, who is our protector, who is our comforter. And people are out there trying to deny that message. And if there's anybody here today who hasn't accepted Jesus as his Saviour, do it. It sounds scary. But get your Bible and read the first few chapters of John and pray to God. God will come and find you because God is real. God is real. He will find you. And so don't be afraid to accept Jesus as your Saviour. Don't be scared to be a Christian. Be a Christian. Believe in God. God is on our side. Each one of you, as I was saying last night, is special. You've all been made so special. You've all been given gifts. Sometimes people say, what is my purpose in life? God has given you a gift. Your purpose in life is just to develop your gift. You may have a gift in art. You may have a gift in being a people person. You may have a gift of being able to see when other people are hurting. That's your gift. And God will help it grow. God wants to perform a miracle in our lives. And we need to encourage anybody. If anybody has any doubts, take your doubts to God. God loves you. Jesus was real. And his resurrection was real. They haven't discovered any body of Jesus. Paul was sort of like, a total opponent. And when he met Jesus, he totally changed. The Bible is full of the people who knew God. They wrote their stories about what it is like to know God. And that's eternal life. John 17:3. This is eternal life, to know God. And John 6:40, this is the will of our Father, my Father in heaven, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him and sees how good God is shall have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. That's Jesus speaking. And that's the hope that we have. That's the message for our young people. Don't be bullied that evolution is true. It's not true. The Bible is true. May God bless you.